He had used the code for people's names just very easily cracked, and people suffered as a consequence. Well, when he went back, not only he got his diaries back, but his poem, Howl, his most famous poem, was broadcast in its entirety on Czech radio. At the same time, that poem cannot be broadcast in the United States on radio because of FCC rules about dirty words. What does that mean? We don't know. I think we're living between dream and reality at this time, in both places. And the thing is pretty unsettled. And the world to come in those countries may resemble less Mark Twain's genteelly corrupt 19th century than the nightmarish constructs of William Burroughs, who's another Missouri writer, but one that wasn't available at Kniga Ruskaya, But I guess between the two of them, that's the vision of Eastern European culture between Mark Twain and William Burroughs. And so, I think Eastern European writers will bring both of those things to us in one form or another. Thanks.
If the audience doesn't mind staying around a little while, we can ask a few questions, I'm sure. So, come up and take come up here. So,
yeah, well, I realize I talked for about 9 hours, but about various things that I didn't finish, But it's better not to finish certain of these ideas because they're not conclusive in any case. None of them. Yes.
I'm interested in your dinner conversation.
Well, well, actually, we talked about Poland and Romania and how different things are. I think what we touched on is how different all these countries are and how different their stages of various development, and how much, in fact, we need each other for various reasons. Yes.
Even though there's sort of pseudo-revolution taking place, even though the revolution was just sort of pseudo, obviously people have a lot more freedom to say what they think. But someday what they are saying and thinking will get in the way of these people. And what do you think will happen when they know the shoe drops?
Well, at this point, I wish there was some magic way to turn words into food. So everything would be okay. The economic situation is so terribly desperate that it seems that everybody is talking, but, and of course the government, the National Salvation Front in Romania encourages splintering of everything into endless grouplets that all issue their own newspaper and they all talk their own line, and that serves their purposes. So you do hear a lot of talk, but as to what it means, probably not much. Just people possibly there are just indulging in the pleasure of talking still because they were quiet for so long. But the euphoria has certainly turned into bitterness, and the kind of talk you hear now is angry and bitter. And I think also that what's realized there is something new has happened there, which is that they've realized fully, whoever were the big players in this whole story, they've realized fully that the electronic media has the power, and the control of television is that's where the new language of images manipulated in a certain way are more powerful than the old ways of speaking, the old print shop, hang-ups of. For quite a long time, those countries were hung up on the word. They feared the word because I think partly because of the beginnings of communism, which were forged in the print shop, in the dark of the print shop, and the manifesto and the conspiratorial discussion groups. Words still had a kind of magic power. But things had changed pretty much by, already by the mid-'60s. words didn't matter that much. That certain images are more powerful. And I think that's the superstition of the words. They're sort of weaning themselves the powers of the superstition of the words. Although, for anyone, not just talking, but distributing those words is very important. And so, what lacks really is a way to get them around. The only opposition newspaper of any dignity and seriousness is a newspaper called Romania Libera, and it is being sabotaged. It never gets to the provinces. It has its run cuts. The paper shortage is being invoked. So, old-style censorship continues very much at that level as well. Yeah.
What can we do in the context of this country to, what responsibility do you think that we have to the people, for instance, of our bigger conversation in Romania and Poland?
Well, one thing that I would very much like to see is people going there, simply going there and talking to people and meeting with various kinds of groups that needs to learn organizational skills, to learn how to create organizations outside of the state, the so-called civil society that everyone talks about, which was a term used in other countries, but in Romania there was never an opportunity to create a civil society because the repression was so severe. Talking to people, that. And the other thing is just simply helping once, finding the, people who hold hope, and in this case I think some of the student groups, rather than the organized political parties, are really much more hopeful than anything else. Helping them get typewriters, electric typewriters, copiers. Fax machines are pretty useless, I think, because the phones are so bad you can't get through. Computers are very difficult to, the software isn't translated, so it's hard for them to learn them. But, if anybody goes there, let's say somewhere, connects and stays for a year, on some sort of foundation grant, so say $18,000, and teach 20 people how to, and translate software and teach them how to use computers, it would be definitely a useful thing. There are all sorts of ways, but even on the most basic levels, there are people now doing all sorts of things for the children, the orphans, but it's hard to, all these contacts will have to be made with real people that are not connected to the government, because the government is nothing but a bureaucracy. Although there may be honest people operating in there too, but it's very difficult to find them. Yes?
Is it prospect for a change, getting rid of Iliescu and his cohorts and anything like that?
Well, I think there will be a change, but I'm afraid that it will be for the worse, I think there will be an overt military dictatorship in Romania before the end of next year.
Is that Iliescu?
No, I think Iliescu will be removed, and there will be somebody like General Stănculescu or any of these people, because nobody knows who really runs things in the country, and the army has an image problem in Romania, because they were seen as the heroes of the revolution because they supposedly came to the side of the people. As it now turns out, they were actually the killers as well, because all the people killed were killed by the army, and. But that's not. They're still seen in this great heroic role, and then that is the reason why in June the army didn't come to restore order on the call of the president, but the so-called miners were called in, who also happened to be soldiers working in the mines, as a matter of fact. But the army didn't come in, and General Victor Stănculescu, the defense chief, disappeared for 6 hours on June 14. He was nowhere to be found. The president of the country couldn't find his defense chief for 6 hours. We asked him about that, actually interviewed him, and he said, well, I was at a Warsaw Pact meeting. And I said, well, yeah, but it seems like the president could find you. But he didn't want to get involved because he didn't want the army to be seen beating people up. But I think it's coming to a point where there's such a widespread crisis of confidence in the government that nobody believes it, that the only solution is a military coup. unless there is another revolution, and it's entirely possible. The problem is complicated by the nationalist question because there is a very strong nationalist movement in Romania now, way to the right, Vatra Românească, the Romanian Hearth, and it contains people of all kinds. It's been utterly infiltrated by people from the old regime. A lot of secret police is part of this organization now. They know only one thing, how to be brutal. And this organization doesn't have a large platform. It just has a nationalist platform. We like us and we don't like them. And they have 4.5 million members and probably that many sympathizers. The largest organization now going with, a somewhat nationalist government in Hungary as well. We're headed for all kinds of conflicts in that area, and they're not pretty, any of them. So hope, I don't think. Yeah.
What, following along that line, what sort of cabinet major will Moldavia, Bessarabia be?
Well, that probably is more of a Russian problem, than a Romanian problem, because, so Moldavia wants to rejoin Romania. Yeah. Yes.
I've always been told that there are very substantial natural resources in Romania, and that Ceausescu went a long distance toward paying off the national debt. Why isn't the economic outlook good, therefore?
There are several possible answers to that. One of them is that it's being sabotaged by people who want to see the government fail.
Can't Romania feed itself?
Yeah, I think the country can. I mean, it seems like it could. It's the problems are in the distribution and in the cumbersome, in the distribution systems that were set up. The other thing that I've heard in Romania now when I was there is that everybody says, "Well, nobody wants to work anymore. Nobody's working." Well, what's that mean? I don't know. I don't know if anybody worked before. They're working even less. I don't. It is mysterious, and I mean it has. There are parts of the countries that are fairly well off in terms of food, anyway. I know that in my hometown in Transylvania, Sibiu wasn't doing very bad, and that's because there are markets set up by peasants from the surrounding area, and there was food coming in. There's quite a black market, too. But I don't know the problem of how these resources are managed. I think just very badly, just like everything else, because many of the major industries are bankrupt. The steel industries took most of the country's resources for quite some time, and I mean it produced inferior steel with the purpose of dumping it on the American market at the time when the American market was depressed. Well, by the time they finally got it together to make steel, we had recovered, and besides they didn't have the ships to transport it, they invested in that too. So this is mid-'70s business, and I mean these things now exist, but they're useless. But I don't know. I haven't read a good economic analysis of why the country is in such bad shape, because it would seem like it shouldn't be. Because you're right, it has no foreign debt. On the other hand, the United States government hasn't renewed most favored nation status to Romania, which I understand and I approve of, in fact. But, it does seem somewhat hypocritical since Ceausescu himself had that particular, privilege during his tenure. So, big mess. I don't know. I really don't know the answer to the question. I just haven't read. Someone should be, offering a little more than theory, i.e. some facts and figures, but I haven't seen them.
We have one more question.
Yes.
Is there anyone in an opposition other than the nationalists who could come up through another revolution to be a leader such as Václav Havel?
Well, the intellectuals and the students are, to my eyes, the only progressive political force in the country right now. They look toward Europe. They are, they have some very good ideas, but it's a student movement that resembles, in a way, the '60s here, and it's not very well organized, and the intellectuals have had to make a leap of the imagination to go into the opposition rather than be dissidents, and that's turning out to be difficult. And there is something else too, which is that there has been a long-standing policy throughout Romanian history to divide the intellectuals from the working people and from the peasants. So there is suspicion and mistrust on all sides. And so, one thing that the students and the intellectuals will have to figure out is how to talk to workers and to peasants, and they don't know how. So I think that until that sort of dialogue is established, I don't know what can be done. Yeah. Sure, one more.
This one changes the subject completely. I would like you to, if you can, just weave 3 points together that you made. You kind of, they sort of left me thinking. You sort of threatened to drown us with words, and in fact,
I didn't?
for me at least, what you did was maybe wet my thirst a little bit rather than drown me.
Oh, okay.
You spoke of what I feel is sort of a desert of electronic mass media and its effect on words in this country. And you mentioned the unfortunate death of a poet, friend of yours last night, which I see mainly as metaphoric of the demise, perhaps, of poetry in our country. Where do you see any possibility of a revival of real American poetry in the near future? What would it take?
Well, my friend's death is really pretty literal, yeah, I would hope, yes, but I don't know. I wrote a whole book about this business. It's called The Disappearance of the Outside, and I'm precisely trying to figure out if the outside that I knew, the one outside that I knew in the mid-'60s, and it wasn't really outside because it was outside established institutions. And that's what made it possible to have, I think, at that point, an art that was at least potentially as interesting as the life around us, although I think the art was smaller than the life around us. It wasn't as interesting, although we tried to reach for it. Whether that will occur again in this century, and I have a feeling that it won't. I think that we have been, we are now inside a growing interior, and one that is more, that American life is being institutionalized, and we are being institutionalized more and more, and there is almost no one outside, and if there was, they couldn't survive. It's almost impossible to find anyone now who's either not inside a university or a prison or in the army or inside, in any case, in a real, and literally the outside is diminishing. If you look at it ecologically as well, from the wilderness is becoming smaller. So the outside is something that, the possibility of it. And I'm not even sure that what I experienced in the mid-'60s was a true outside, or whether it was a kind of flash before it all went away. I don't know. I always look at popular culture for cues of that business, because and to the language of the street for that too, because that's vital language, and that's where language is in a true creative state, because language in the street defines itself in opposition to the status quo, in opposition to institutional language, and we had a fairly vital number of languages around for a while in the mid-'60s, and perhaps beginning in the '50s with jazz talk and bop, and then beat talk and street languages of various kinds, where there was an actual culture being made out there. But I don't see that happening now. What I see is coming back from television, a kind of language that's very attenuated and very. And if there is language going on the street, and it gets co-opted very quickly, and it gets turned into advertising very fast. So.
How about rap?
Well, I think rap is a terrific street poetry. So far as it, has messages that appeal directly to the kids that it's, and to no one else. It's probably, rap and graffiti. I mean, there you have, something, but the connection is missing, to high culture or to culture, in a larger sense, which it seemed to me that. In mid-60s, we'd taken the entire province of the culture for our domain, and using, the language to speak at all levels. So it may be just more narrowly forced into some kind of, I don't see any writers, for instance, taking up rap, poets,
Thank you.